Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Chris Uhlmann. Coming up, has Julia Gillard stolen Tony Abbott's welfare policy? Why Andrew Robb wants the federal police involved in the campaign. And look at me, why Kevin Rudd's new billboard is all about him. Our panel tonight, Licciardello from the Chasers Yes We Canberra, former New South Wales leader Kerry Chikarovski, and blogger and author Antony Loewenstein.
Now,
good evening.
Say all that 5 times 5.
I know. And if any of you can Twitter those names and mine, getting the spelling correct, there's a yet-to-be-identified drum prize to hand out at the end of this evening. But first, Labor's Get Tough welfare policy. Under the changes, family benefits will be tied to mandatory health checks for children at the age of 4, and job seekers will stop receiving the dole if they don't turn up for appointments.
This is part of making the point very clearly that people who can work should work. We expect compliance with obligations under our Centrelink and Job Services Australia system.
The government will also provide financial assistance of up to $6,000 for unemployed Australians willing to relocate for a job, a policy the Liberals says is theirs.
Julia Gillard stole Kevin Rudd's jobs. Now Julia Gillard is stealing Tony Abbott's policy.
Well, the Drum's Steve Kinane asked job seekers outside a Centrelink office in Sydney, the Sydney Liberal seat of Wentworth, what they thought about the idea of welfare payments being cut off.
What do you think about Julia Gillard's idea to kick people off welfare if they don't make their appointments?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. I mean, we've got to make an effort. We can't just be bludgers and just be lazy about it. We've got to be proactive. I agree with that.
Well, I think they've already been doing that anyway, so it's nothing unusual.
Well, I think it's a bit foolish because there is just some times when people can't get to the appointments and they don't also have the ability to just call up and ring and say, look, I can't come in or anything like that. You know, they don't take that into account.
Julia Gillard's saying that 42% of the time people aren't making their appointments and that's not good enough.
Well, all I can say is by me, I go to 100% of my appointments.
It seems to be a little irresponsible for those people who would find it difficult to make it to an appointment on schedule.
Why can't people make it to appointments? Why can't they turn up why is there not an obligation to turn up if they're getting paid welfare?
Well, I would say it's preferable to turn up. I mean, it seems to be the responsible thing to do. But I mean, obviously there are various factors that would affect one's ability to make it to a centre. I mean, if one is disabled or inconvenienced somehow, I can see how that would be a mitigating factor.
I don't think that's particularly fair, considering not everybody has access to get to these services quite as easily as, everyone else. So maybe what happens if I'm disabled and I don't have any friends or family and I can't get there just as easily as someone who is able.
Well, Kerry Chikarovski, is that policy theft?
Well, certainly the relocating allowance is theft. I think that Tony announced something along those lines about 6 months ago. And my recollection is that Paul Howes accused him of having a Sarah Palin/Pauline Hanson moment when he was suggesting that people should go from areas of great employment to areas of great unemployment. Mark Abib accused him of being, bizarre policy, I think it was he said about it. So I'm kind of intrigued by the fact that Julia was saying earlier in the campaign that Tony Abbott was agreeing with her, for example, on refugees. I think Tony should be very flattered that Julia Gillard is now agreeing with him about a policy such as this.
Yeah, it's interesting too, guys, that a lot of her policies, her education policies too, are a move to the right.
And can I just interrupt there? And if you actually go back and have a look at what Brendan Nelson was announcing way back when he talked about education policy, I think you'll find that Julia obviously read that speech, because a lot of what Brendan announced is now being trotted out as Labor Party policy.
Chaz?
Well, yeah, first of all, are we talking about when Tony Abbott announced that he thought that you should cut the dole for under 30s who don't go get jobs in the bush? Because if we're talking about that, I think that's a bit of a different policy, to be honest. For a start, by the way, I like the fact we're talking about stealing policies, because that means we're talking about policies, which is a nice change. But on that note, I think Tony Abbott took more the stick approach, and this is more the carrot approach, where you actually give him the money. So, to be fair, and also I also don't think that he actually announced that as a policy so much as it was kind of noodling in a sort of a Tony Abbott way.
Oh, I think that's a little...
Yeah, look, I'm not knocking him. I'm just saying that I'm not sure they're exactly the same thing. So, I think it's a little bit like me saying after Minority Report, I really think it'd be great to have a touchscreen phone, and then go, well, Steve Jobs, you stole my iPhone idea. You know, like, I think, to be honest, as long as it's a good policy, I'm not saying that they're not cribbing off each other a little bit, because, let's face it, if it's a good idea...
I think there was money involved.
I
think there was money involved with Tony's policy. I think he was actually suggesting money to encourage them to...
Well, like I said, I wasn't absolutely sure about that, but I do think that the important thing is whether the policy works.
That's exactly the point. I mean, you mentioned before, Chris, the idea that the Labor Party is moving further to the right to mimic what they perceive to be as, I guess, Abbott's ascendancy in terms of his policies. I mean, the question is, Chaz, is this actually going to work? We've seen the US and the UK attempts in the last few decades to try similar kind of policies. Sometimes they've failed spectacularly. I mean, one also looks even the local case here, the Northern Territory intervention, where there's been attempts at kind of welfare regulation. In many cases, it actually hasn't worked to achieve the goals both the Howard government and Rudd government and now Gillard government wanted to achieve. So, stealing policies, I don't think the electorate really cares if it's one policy over another. You know, I mean, on so many issues, they're so similar. That the question...
But it is mutual obligation, isn't it, Kerry? That's essentially the driving philosophy is that.
Which is very much sitting on the side of the Conservatives. They've always been advocating mutual obligation, and you know, it is being adopted, as you say, around the world. But it comes back to a policy which was, you know, under the Howard government. It was all about mutual obligation. It was about saying that you can't just expect a handout from cradle to grave without actually making a contribution back, you know, earning something from it. And I think it's really interesting because Tony and Joe Hockey have been constantly talking about the need to get participation rates up for under 30s. I mean, that's been something that it's not just today. I mean, he's been talking about that for a while. So their emphasis has been we actually need to make sure that young people are engaged in work, and we need to have policies which do that. So you won't be surprised to say that I'm delighted that the Labor Party has finally come around to our way of thinking.
If I just ask, mention one thing, and that is that, look, I don't think there are many people who have a problem with the idea of someone who just never turns up to Centrelink, just, you know, them having some kind of discipline or something, like having some kind of mutual obligation. But the question I'd like to ask is, rather than having some kind of mandatory policy where, you know, it's if this happens, then this happens, if this happens, then this happens.
It's punitive.
Yeah, rather than having something like I'd be more interested in knowing why these people are not turning up. Because you don't have a situation where people, almost their job is to just fulfil their New Start obligations. And if you have if you have a situation where people actually are incentivised to try and get a job,
that's a conservative word too.
Yes,
so you're dragging it out now. Incentivised.
Your word.
See, now it's catching. It's like a big disease.
I'm just standing up for real action. That's all I'm doing.
Someone from the Chaser using a conservative
He's moving forward. He's obviously moving forward.
And you know, the thing was, he didn't even know he was. So you're winning by still.
We are. We're actually taking over the world.
But of course, one of the things also we should say, though, I mean, during the Howard years, there was what was often termed middle-class welfare. In other words, there were so many groups in society who often did need money or assistance. That's true, often given during election campaigns or even without the election campaign. So the idea somehow this is, as Kerry was suggesting, just a Labor Party thing. This is happening across the board, across both parties. It's not new.
Yeah. I think the whole word, by the way, was incentivation. So you're only part of it. You're a little tiny bit.
Give me another 6 months.
It'll pop out, and you won't even know.
10 more days of an election campaign will have you over into the side of the guys.
And Tony Abbott said the most conservative thing you could do is have a family, so that's next. The ALP's other key announcement today was the resurrection of the rail link between Parramatta and Epping in Sydney's northwest. Julia Gillard has promised more than $2 billion in federal funding. That will have many local residents rolling their eyes. It's a project the New South Wales Labor government first promised in 1998, and since then it's been constantly delayed and then dumped, a fact that Tony Abbott was quick to jump on.
The people of Western Sydney know that Labor has form here. Big promises before an election, broken promises after an election. All that you get delivered is glossy brochures but no infrastructure.
Well, Antony, they seem to know what they're talking about there, because the vox pops that we saw on the rail station were precisely that. Well, will it ever happen?
And you can't blame New South Wales voters to be disillusioned with the Labor government here because they're a disaster. But in some ways, I think actually I'm going to take the side of what the government's trying to do here. The theory of it is good. Over the last sort of 10 years, we've seen more and more investment in roads, in actually not in public transport. Public transport is, if we believe in any kind of sustainability, that word is often used and abused. That's what we need to move forward, want a better expression.
Oh, I'm writing these down. You people have all been brainwashed and do nothing but watch television.
I think Julie's stolen my term, but no, the idea that public transport should be investment in that, and I think the idea of a better train system is good. Whether this is actually ever going to happen, who the hell knows, clearly, and it's not unfair that people are sceptical about it, but the idea, I would argue, in fact, is a good one.
No one is going to argue against public transport. I mean, that's just a given.
Some do.
And in New South Wales in particular, and in Sydney and in the west of Sydney, there is not a single person who lives out there. There's not a single person who's a politician now, or who would potentially be a politician in the future, who's going to argue about the need for public transport in the Western Sydney. The problem is, this particular project was dropped by the New South Wales government
a few months ago.
Earlier this year.
Yeah.
They said it wasn't a priority. They said, oh no, we've got other more important things we're going to look at. And so you go, why, if it wasn't a priority to the government a few months ago, why would anyone suddenly believe that it's a priority now? I reckon if you actually took all the reports, all the media releases, all the bits and pieces of paper around public transport announcements in New South Wales for the last 16 years almost, since the Labor government has come in, you could probably solve the carbon problem, because there have been so many trees cut down to produce all those things and no result.
You could probably build a paper train line from Epping to Parramatta.
You could have.
Darwin for that.
Look, I got to say, of all the worlds in which this rail line might happen, this is probably the one that's most likely happening, because it almost doesn't involve the New South Wales government. Yeah. Like, they're chipping in a tiny little bit of money and the rest is coming from the federal government. So maybe, just maybe, it might happen this time.
But it's not going to come about until if Gillard gets elected this time. That's the second term. And it's not really going to happen until a third term election. So why would people think that?
Well,
why would people think it's actually going to happen?
Can we also make a request made that politicians don't appear with hard hats? So this is
No. Because, if you're on television news, and those pictures are very valuable.
Yes, you love politicians and silly hats.
It makes them look serious. It makes them look serious.
I've got to say, I think while Labor politicians are campaigning in Western Sydney, they should wear hard hats. Because a lot of people want to have a go at them.
That could be the point. Maybe we're missing the actual reason why they're wearing hard hats.
It was actually a safety reason. Absolutely.
Why can't we do rail? Why can't we do public infrastructure properly, particularly in Sydney? What's the problem?
Well, you need to have some political will, that's the first thing, because you're actually going to decide which is the priority, because everybody puts their hand up and says. And, I heard that there was a text message in from Barry O'Farrell saying that's not their priority. Northwest sector, southwest sector are going to be their priority. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because the southwest sector has been designated a growth area for housing and population, as has the northwest sector. So you would think that putting a heavy rail line into those two areas should be a priority. So I think, first of all, you need to have a government which is going to be prepared to say, we will commit to a project and this is what it's going to be. And then you've got to work out how you're going to fund it.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the reason why is because you pay the money now and you get the benefit in 3 terms' time, which means we will never have a train line built ever again.
I mean, I think if you're actually serious about the planning of Sydney and the growth in Sydney, and everyone, the one